Hi, and welcome to another edition of Kenduck's Classroom. Now, in this edition of Kenduck's Classroom, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss two very important compromises that took place at the Constitutional Convention starting in 1787. And the first compromise that I'm going to take a look at is the so-called Great Compromise. And the second compromise that I'm going to take a look at today is called the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, let's start off with the Great Compromise. Essentially, what had happened was at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the delegates from each of the 13 states had decided that the old Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and yes, by the way, there is another video on the Articles of Confederation. They decided the Articles of Confederation was not good enough, and so they wanted to come up with a new document, a new constitution to help rule our country. But what had happened was there were a bunch of different deals of negotiations that had to take place before the Constitution could be written and later on ratified and put into effect. So the so-called Great Compromise is the first compromise we're going to talk about. And what this compromise has to do with is what would become the legislative branch of the new U.S. national federal government. And basically what you had were two different plans. One plan for the new legislative branch had to do with how many votes each state would have in the new legislative branch of government. And so one plan, the so-called small state plan, or the New Jersey plan, was written by a gentleman by the name of William Patterson. And what he said was that every state should continue to have one vote when it comes to passing a law. And that's kind of how it was under the Articles of Confederation government. In the Articles government, each state was allowed to send several delegates, but when it came to voting on a law for the country, each state only had one vote. And the small states like that because if you think about it, the small states, even though they're less populated, less people live in them, they have just as much influence as the big states, the more powerful states like Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania. So again, just to review, this is the so-called New Jersey plan or the small state plan, where in the new legislative branch of government, each state would have one vote when it came to making a law. Now, of course, the large states were not going to put up with this. States like New York, Virginia, they did not think this was fair. They did not think this is right. They believed that because their states were much, much more populated, that they should have more influence in the form of more votes. And so the so-called who would become the father of the Constitution, James Madison from, of course, the state of Virginia, he had a plan called the Virginia Plan or the Large State Plan. And what his plan called for was there to be two houses within the legislative branch of government, and each state would get to have a number of representatives in each house based on the population. So this made the large states happy because they would have more voting power, clearly because they would have more votes. Of course, the small states weren't going to put up for that. And eventually what ends up happening is a gentleman by the name of Roger Sherman from Connecticut, he was one of the delegates from Connecticut at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. He has a plan, and it's what would be called the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. And what that plan said was that in the legislative branch of government, there would be two houses. One house would be based on population, and that would become known as the U.S. House of Representatives. And the other house in the legislative branch of government would be the United States Senate. But in the Senate, each state would have two senators or two votes when it came to passing laws. So with this Connecticut Compromise, it kind of makes everybody happy. The large states are happy because now the more populous states get to have more representatives, because in the House of Representatives, the number of votes and representatives you get in each state is based on population, according to this plan. So the large states are happy. They feel like they have the power to direct laws the way they might want to make them. At the same time, though, if you take a look at the Senate, each state has 2 senators and hence 2 votes. The votes are equal in the U.S. Senate. And so if the large states passed a law in the House of Representatives and it was a really bad law that was going to hurt the smaller states would have a chance to be able to block that law from passing because they would have enough votes to stop that law. So that is the so-called Great Compromise. One more time, just to review, because of the Great Compromise, we have 2 houses in the legislative branch of government. One is based on population. That is called the House of Representatives. And of course, by the way, any law having to do with taxes or funding usually has to start in the House of Representatives. It's the House of the people. It's also, by the way, the only part of the original U.S. government that was directly elected by the people. So, in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives is based on population. In the other house, the U.S. Senate, it's not based on population. Every state has 2 senators and 2 votes, an equal amount of votes. So, if the large states were ever going to pass a law, the whole idea is that the small states would be able to stop that law from passing in the U.S. Senate. All right, so that is the so-called Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. Well, hello, I'm back. And what I would like to do now is I would like to discuss the so-called 3/5 compromise. This was a second key compromise that took place at the Constitutional Convention starting in 1787. Now, we just talked about the so-called Great Compromise, where it was established that in one of the 2 houses in the new legislative branch of government, that house would be based on population, meaning the larger population that a state had, the more members of the U.S. House of Representatives that state would get to elect. And so one of the issues, of course, that pops up here is the question of, will slaves be counted as part of the population? Now, you might think, well, why is this a big deal? It actually kind of is a big deal because a vast majority of the slaves in this country are located in the southern states. Now, there's a myth that there's no slaves in the north. That's absolutely false. There's slaves in all 13 of the states. However, by proportion and by number, most slaves are concentrated in the South. And so since the South has larger amounts of slaves, theoretically their population would be larger, and then they would get more members of the House of Representatives based on their population. And the North is not going to go for this. States in the North that don't have as many slaves would get less members, theoretically, of the House of Representatives because those number of slaves are not as large as they are in the South. So what happens is there's discussion and there's debate, and what the men at the Constitutional Convention decide to do is they decide to have a slave be worth 3/5 of the person. Now, this doesn't mean that a slave gets 3/5 of the rights that a citizen may get. It doesn't mean that at all. This is purely for counting the population of each state to determine how many members of the House of Representatives that state will get. And so what they do is they come to an agreement that a slave will be counted as 3/5 of the person. So what this means is, for example, if New Jersey had 5 slaves, then when you counted New Jersey's population, that would only count as 3 people in the population based on those 5 slaves. So figure it kind of like this. Let's say Connecticut has 100 slaves. When you count the population of Connecticut, those 100 slaves will only count as 60 people to go towards the total population of Connecticut. So to see if you actually understand the concept that I'm getting at, let's say that North Carolina has 1,000 slaves. So if North Carolina has 1,000 slaves, what is the number that will be actually counted towards the total population in that state? I'll give you a couple of seconds to figure it out. Take out a calculator or just do some math. Go. Okay, so I'm not sure if you had a chance to figure it out, but the answer would be 600 people. All right, if you take the proportion of 3/5 and there are 1,000 slaves in that particular state, North Carolina in this case, then the number would be 600. Okay, so that's how you would figure out the population in regards to the slaves, and this was all part of the compromise. Now, again, there wasn't really any talk at the Constitutional Convention about getting rid of slavery. The only other part about slavery that was discussed was that in 20 years, from 1788, which would be about 1808, the international slave trade would be banned in the United States of America. Again, is our slavery being banned? Absolutely not. It's just that someone cannot purchase a slave from another country, but they can purchase a slave from another state. So for example, if you lived in Virginia, you would be permitted to buy a slave from, say, South Carolina. You just couldn't buy a slave from another country. Okay, so again, the international slave trade is banned in 1808. That was put into the Constitution, but there's no discussion of banning slavery. The only key discussion in regard to slavery was the so-called 3/5 compromise. All right, this is Mr. Kenduck signing off. Goodbye.